Well, we're going to resume our scientific presentation and move to the seminar, which is dedicated this year to the development of the brain and development of cognitive representations. And I'm extremely happy to welcome today Sandy Waxman, who just said she doesn't travel too much, and it's true. I don't think we've heard you at Collège de France before. We're very happy to host you today. Sandy Waxman is a professor, distinguished professor at Northwestern University in Chicago. She studied initially for a PhD at Penn, in Pennsylvania, with outstanding people, Lila Gleitman and Rochelle Gelman. And she studies language development and conceptual development. She will tell us all about it. I just want to say that she's an extremely distinguished researcher, and she's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which is very distinguished membership. And she received prizes from the Guggenheim, from the American Psychological Association. So we are welcoming today a very important researcher in the field of cognitive development. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation.
Oh, thank you. C'est un tel plaisir d'être ici avec vous. Et dès que ce moment, je vais parler en anglais. Ça sera beaucoup mieux pour vos oreilles et beaucoup mieux pour moi. Merci. Okay, so thank you, Stan, for such a lovely introduction. And it really is such a pleasure to be here in really one of my most favorite cities. And I hope to work through the jet lag to get to the point where I can explain to you why I'm so enthusiastic and so excited about studying how and how early infants link language and cognition. So this is going to be a talk where mostly we'll be concerned with behavior, infant behavior, less concerned with infant neural development, though toward the end I'll make some nods and some hints about some recent work where we're looking in that direction. Okay. So the questions that we're going to be thinking about today are motivated by questions concerning the origin and the unfolding of two uniquely human capacities, language and cognition, okay? Oh, by the way, I should say, if I'm speaking too quickly, please just say so. Raise your hands, say stop, stop. Even in English, I'm known to be a quick speaker. I'm from a region, the East Coast, where we speak very, very quickly. I now live in the Midwest. I've learned to slow down, a little détente. But even so, if it's too fast, please, please let me know. Okay, so I said that I wanted to look at two systems, or the integration of two systems that I'm going to call uniquely human. And it's the integration of those systems that is uniquely human. So one I said was language. And you may be thinking, well, but for sure, there are communication systems throughout the animal kingdom, maybe even in the plant kingdom, we now know. It's for sure the case that there is communication among non-human animals. It's a requirement among non-human animals. But none of these communication systems approaches human language in many ways for its exquisite the exquisite detail of its signals, for the elegance of its grammar, for the precision with which we distinguish words like dog and dag, for example. Most importantly for today, none of these other systems show the ability to link to meaning, from the communication system to meaning in the here and now, okay, and beyond the here and now. So none of the other communication systems can go beyond the here and now, to my understanding. To talk about the past, to imagine the future, to create mathematics, to discover and create music, logic, poetry. These are systems that are ubiquitous in humans. We can't keep from developing them if we're human, but we don't see in other species. And for sure, I mentioned cognition, language and cognition. Absolutely sure that other non-human species have cognition, and very important, very powerful pieces of cognition. They have representational capacities that let them form categories and concepts, like the categories Stan was talking about earlier. They can represent space, they can navigate space, they can estimate quantities, they can learn abstract rules in the non-human animal. What's unique, as I said, is that in the human, these two systems, the communication system and the representational system, are married, okay? And this was the insight of George Miller decades ago, the 1980s or 1970s, he was one of the fathers of the cognitive revolution, when we started really thinking hard about what is human cognition and how can we best study it, both behaviorally and neurally. Okay, so this marriage between language and cognition, I believe, brings us unparalleled flexibility. And what I mean by that is we can represent, unlike a member of another species, we can represent any individual object or action in many, many different ways. So for example, I could, pardon me, that's not an excellent example when I'm mic'd up. I could do this, right? And I may mean to represent this clicker. Oh, it goes this way. I may mean to represent the clicker. I may mean to represent anything that's tall and thick. I may mean to represent something that Stan gave me, in which case it would be this and an introduction. That's a very abstract notion. I may mean to represent something that's black. And I can switch upon these representations on a dime. That's a phrase in English that means flexibly. Because we have language and cognition coming together, I can shift, like create a zoom lens for you to think about this object as something black, something straight, something that Stan gave me, etc. Okay, so this link between language and cognition has been shown beautifully in behavioral work and in neural work with adults and with children and some with infants as well. But the important thing to remember is this link does not emerge all of the sudden, all at once, fully formed in a flash, right? Not like Zeus from the head of Athena, fully formed creature. Instead, it emerges dynamically, and it starts to emerge in the very first months of life, and it does so in what we call in developmental science a cascading fashion, which is to say that with each developmental advance, we form the foundation for the next subsequent advances, right? And what this means is that development is dynamic and the cascade is important. And if you're missing a little piece at stage here, you're going to have to compensate or reorganize to get to the next stage forward. And as language is a multimodal and lots of different capacities, the grammar, the sound of the language, etc., right? These are all going to have to interconnect in an important way to create what we call human language. And this cascade is important also, not only in bringing together the components that are human language, but also because when we ask, what is the power of language, or what is the power of a word on an individual, the answer will depend on the developmental moment that that individual is in within that cascade. So it will vary systematically over development, depending on how precisely the baby perceives language, how precisely the baby represents the world, and how precisely she links the two together. Okay, so my idea is that by studying how infants acquire this link, we get a window into what it means to be a human. Okay, so the next question is how then, and how early, do language and cognition come together in the human mind, and how would we discover this? Okay, so this is a picture of my nephew. You see the resemblance when I was young? Okay, this is a picture of my nephew with my newest niece, Eve. And the question is about putting language and thought together is to take a basic strategy, a scientific approach, right? In addition to loving her, we take a scientific approach. And the basic strategy is we identify in these behavioral studies core pieces of cognitive capacity, early core cognition, and core pieces of language capacity, however rudimentary they might be at the very beginning. And we ask how these are shaped, how these are tuned, right, over development. And in this enterprise, we're looking at the joint contributions of innate capacities and preference in the infant, human infant, and how those capacities are tuned by the infant's experience. Human infants are exquisitely sensitive to experience. Perhaps more so than infants of other species, because as a species, we're born precocious, which is to say we're an altricial species, which is to say we're born neurally and behaviorally less mature than infants in other species, okay? So the opportunity to be shaped by the environment is really quite vast, and especially because we have strong learning capacities, this is really quite powerful, the interaction between, as we say, nature with nurture. Okay, so we know, of course, that when infants are born, they're not blank slates. It's not like they're completely null with regard to language or with regard to preferences. We know from excellent work with infants, much of it here in Paris, that infants are born with a preference for listening to human language, which is amazing, right? And a preference for looking at human faces over other stimuli. And in fact, they show distinct neural processing for human language and for human faces. And in fact, over the first year, babies tune increasingly precisely to the sounds of their own language, their own native language. This is called perceptual tuning, and it's a kind of tuning, anytime you're talking about language, it's multimodal, which is to say that the babies are looking at us visually and hearing us auditorily if they're hearing infants, right? A different, very related story if they're deaf infants learning a sign language. For today, hearing infants. Language is a multimodal process. Okay. So we know that babies are doing some pretty fancy perceptual tuning during the first year and that they're born with some very powerful innate capacities. The point that I want to make today, if anything, there's a takeaway message, it's this. Acquiring a human language requires more than tuning to its signals. It's not enough that we identify which are the language signals and which are the non-linguistic signals, the coughs, the sound of the fan coming on versus the sound of language. It's not enough to pull those apart. But it's also what you have to do also to acquire human language is to link the signals of language to some kind of meaning, to some kind of representations, cognitive representations in the world. And the question is, how do they break into this system, right? And the point I'll also make at the beginning is, so point one, what's important is not only how precise they are and how abstract they are about dealing with the language system, but how they make the link between listening to language and finding meaning and finding abstraction in the world. And the important point to remember, which I tell people in the US all the time, is this. We somehow have the idea, well, they prefer listening to language, and so everything just follows, right? No. The fact that you have a preference for a signal is really mute with regard to whether you'll link that signal to anything in the world, okay? I hope this is clear. I love the music of the cello. I love the sound of the cello. I don't link the emission of the cello to any kind of abstract language kind of meaning. I don't translate it in that way, only language. Only for language do I do that. And the question is, how do the babies get there? All right, so Stan reminded me that it wasn't a class of students who have been reading psychology for the last week, and so I should remind you about what the nature of the problem is. So here's the problem. How do babies break into this system, which is going to cascade? If they're going to establish a link between meaning, if you will, and language, right? They're going to have to set their sights in two distinct directions, right? From the linguistic domain, they're going to have to cull the communicative signals of their species and cull words and phrases from the melody of human language in which they are immersed, right? The melody of human language. And they're going to learn what are the words and what are the rules that govern the use of those words. So I can say, I'm tired versus you're tired. It means something very different, okay? That's facing the linguistic domain. They have to pull language out. Facing the cognitive domain, they have to link the language they hear to something cognitive, to fundamental relations among people, among objects, and among the events that they encounter. Now, you may say, what's the problem? This shouldn't be so hard. And for centuries, some of the brightest scholars, John Locke, the philosopher among them, said, well, it's not really a problem. What you do is you detect a word, like yellow, jaune, right? You detect a word, you detect an experience in the world, you slap them together, and voila, you have it. You make a meaning. This would be a pure association. But this solution, though simple, right, and sensible in a certain way immediately runs aground. And it runs aground because of something in cognitive psychology that we describe as the problem of the indeterminacy of meaning, right? The indeterminacy of meaning. This is a core theoretical problem in cognitive science, and it's an empirical problem that the baby solves rapidly and easily. Let me make this idea more concrete for you. Okay, so here's you in a park, and you have your niece or your nephew on your lap, and this lovely event unfolds. A little dog runs up, and the girl gives the dog a hug, and you comment on this to the infant in your lap, okay? Well, the tutor might say many different things. Remember, this is the indeterminacy of meaning that we're talking about, okay? The tutor might say many things. First, the tutor, if it's the mother, might say, oh, it's time to call daddy. Got to go pick him up at the train station, right? So you don't want a system that hears something, sees something, and immediately makes a mapping. That would be too gross. That would be too broad, okay? But let's restrict ourselves to the situations where the tutor, you, and the infant are looking at the same thing, and the talk is going to be about that thing. So not let's call daddy, but where you're talking about the event. Maybe this will make John Locke's solution go through. Well, you could say, look, it's a dog. In which case, you mean to refer to the object, qua object, the dog itself, right? And also, you mean to extend that word, and the baby will have to learn to extend that word to other members of the same kind, other dogs, right? How's the baby going to know it's dogs and not all animals? That's a problem for the representational system, and it's a problem for the social system, right? But in any case, so they have to come to the scope of the meaning, right? And they'll learn that quickly. When they see a cat and the dad says, that's a cat, right? They can sort of push in to get the semantic meaning that we in English or you in French have for dog. Okay, but the point is when you say it's a dog, you mean to refer to this dog and to all other dogs. But you might also say, look, it's Freddie, in which case you also mean to refer to the dog, but not to all dogs. You mean just that dog, and you don't extend a fact or an ID that you learn about Freddie to all other dogs. It's worse. You could say, look, it's Fluffy, which is to say it's soft, in which case you don't refer to the dog, right? You're referring to a property, a qualia of the dog, and you don't extend this property on the basis of object kind. Instead, you extend it across object kind to many different kinds of objects. So your bedroom slippers or your new towels or, you know, a hat with a puffy ball at the end of it, right? So Fluffy doesn't refer to an object. It refers to a qualia, a property. Okay, and you can also say, he's kissing her. Here you're referring neither to the dog nor to the child, but to the relation between them. And if you understand the meaning of the word kiss, then you know that you can apply that independent of what the objects or the object categories are, right? Kissing can be the case whether it's a dog and a girl, or any other two entities that you can imagine. Okay, so you abstract over object kind to get to these relations like the verbs. Okay, so the point here is that any language, any human language has different kinds of words, nouns, verbs, adjectives, articles, right? And each kind of word is linked to or relates to different kinds of meaning. This is like sometimes considered a syntax semantic mapping. Really, we are not being even as precise as that. We're saying the kinds of words, nouns, adjectives, and verbs tend across languages to refer to these distinct kinds of meaning. Objects, properties of objects or events, and events or relations among objects themselves. Okay, so you can see that hearing a word, seeing an event, slapping them together is not going to solve the problem of how the baby breaks into the system of learning the meaning of a word. Okay, moreover, these precise links between different kinds of words and different kinds of meaning don't come all at once. Instead, what happens is, and I'm going to go quickly on this because I want to talk about younger infants. Instead, early on, at around 12 months of age, when babies first begin to say their first words, though there's been language acquisition going on well before that, right? When at around 12 months, what babies first do is identify the nouns in their language, right, in their spoken language, And they map those nouns specifically to categories of objects and individual objects. So they develop first a precise link between nouns and object categories. At this time, they're still very open with regard to the verbs and the adjectives and the other predicate terms. Any kind of word can refer to any kind of commonality, the property, the relation, the objects themselves. They're still agnostic. They haven't figured it out. But they use, having learned the nouns and mapping them to object categories, as a wedge to discover these distinct other relations. And those become clear, the nouns and the adjectives and verbs, somewhere between 18 to 24 months. They show precise expectations about this kind of word should refer to this kind of property. So if I say this is black, but they don't know the word black, they're 18-month-olds, you say this is blick, this is a blick one, they'll know it refers not to the object, but to a qualia of the object. If you say this is a blick, tiny difference. This is blick versus this is a blick. Now they think it refers to this object and to other members of the same category. That's quite phenomenal and quite fancy, as we say. And that is a real use of language and tuning the language concept link. Okay, so what I want to do today is to describe what we know about these infants on the threshold of producing language, babies like I just described at around 12 months of age. You may be thinking, how do you know that they have a precise expectation about nouns that's different than verbs? I'm going to go rather quickly through what we know about the babies at 12 months, because what I really want to do is ask where this capacity, where this fine link between language and cognition comes from. And there we'll be looking back in developmental time at babies who are around 3 to 6 months of age. And the reason we do this, of course, is because we're interested as developmentalists in describing how it is that we become human, how it is that you became you with regard to your language and concept link, right? And so what we want to know is unless we can first describe the capacities of the baby at 3 months or even neonates, right? We can't come up with a terrific explanation of the development and the developmental cascades, okay? So we're going to start at the beginning, at what I used to think was the beginning, which is when babies first begin to map words to objects. Okay, it is okay if I walk around a little. I'm really not used to sitting still. Okay, so tell me if you can hear me okay? Okay. So you may ask, I don't know, have people here heard about infant studies much and visual preference tasks? A little bit. Most everybody. Okay, so this is a review for many of you then. So what we do in our tasks is we're going to use, for all the experiments I'll talk about today, we'll use object categorization as our case in point for cognition, right? Just for today, that's our case in point. You can ask me, where else do you see these effects, Sandy? Right? What other capacities? What other cognitive capacities? And we'll get to that. But the demonstration case today is categorization. So here you see a visual stream, right? And we have for babies a familiarization phase and a test phase. This is presented sequentially. So in a familiarization phase, let me describe visually what the baby sees visually, and then what the baby hears. So these are little tinies, they're in our lab. We've done these experiments with real objects and actual people, live experiments. And we've done the same experiments with a video where we can have precise control over how long the baby sees the objects and what exactly the intonational patterns are of the speaker, okay? And we get the same effects no matter what. Okay, so the baby sees 4 discriminably different individual members of a single category. Here I'm showing you the category that you and I call animals, right? The 12-month-old doesn't have a word like animals, right? That's just, they could have a category for this. They may not have learned the word for this yet, right? And it's quite likely that they do. Half of the babies would have been familiarized to the animals, half would be familiarized to discriminably different members of a different category, let's say fruit, different fruits, okay? They see each one at a time for a prescribed amount of time, and then at test they see a new member of the now familiar category, but they haven't seen it before, and a new member of a category that they haven't been familiarized to, okay? So for every experiment, it's all counterbalanced. Half the babies see one category, half see the other, and all babies see more than one example. You know, I'm just showing you one here. They may have 4 trials, they may have 2 trials. That depends how old the baby is and how long we know we can keep their attention in a behavioral task. Okay, so the logic of these designs, as you know, is that if the baby sees what's common about the objects that we present in the familiarization phase, right? If the baby sees, oh, it's just another one of those, it's just the same. If she notes the commonality, then what we should imagine is that her looking time, our measure is the baby's looking time to the objects. What we should see is that the baby's looking time decreases reliably over the familiarization phase, right? And most importantly, that at test, they'll distinguish between the novel and the familiar one. If they haven't formed a category, then it's like being in a toy store. Each one is different than the other, as you can see. And at test, it doesn't matter. They're both new, so they'll look at them equally. I hope that makes sense, okay? So what we're going to be computing for our dependent measure is the preference for either one or the other, the familiar or the novel object. So right there, that's a description of a visual categorization task, right? And I hope you understand the logic. But I'm not interested in just visual categorization. I'm interested in the effect of language on the infant's ability to think, to form this category, right? Now, I am selecting, me and my lab, we and my colleagues are selecting categories that we know the babies won't show the categorization signature, that is, the preference for the novel over the familiar at test, where they won't show that in the absence of some kind of support. I hope that makes sense, right? So it is to say that these are not simple categories for the babies to get in this particular task, okay? Because what we're interested in knowing is what's the value added if the baby is listening to language or listening to novel words in the context of seeing these objects, okay? Hope that's clear. Okay, so here's the hypothesis, or here's the question. At 12 months, half the babies, well, here's the design. Half the babies hear something. Every time an object appears, we say, look here, look at this. Then the object goes away, and another one comes, look here, look at this, right? That's the no word condition. And then we have a novel word condition because I was interested in word learning in this phase of this series of experiments. It sounds exactly the same, except you say, look at the toma. Do you see the toma? Toma is a made-up word in English, but it's an English-sounding word, right? And the question is, will we see any difference in the infant's ability to detect the commonalities among these disparate visual representations in the context of hearing a novel word? This would be like learning dog, 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 or learning animal, right? That's the question, right? So if language augments the kid's cognitive capacity, then we should see successful categorization, more successful categorization with the novel word than without it. And that's in fact what we see. In the no word condition, we've designed the task so that in the no word condition, they see enough objects to be interested, but not enough to form the category. They fail to form the category. But in the precisely same design, the introduction of this novel word, which by the way, they've never heard before. It's not like mom or dog, it's a novel word. In the context of hearing the same novel word applied to these distinctly different individuals, they form the category successfully. Okay, so then you could ask, well, is this because, I shouldn't have done this yet, but there you go. Is this because of the power of the novel word highlighting what's common about these individuals? That would be something very powerful, very adult-like, right? All the things that I call a toma, you imagine must be members of the same category. Or is it something much less fancy? Is it just that we know that babies at this age are very interested in new words? They're in the process of learning their first words, right? And so in the context of hearing a novel word, toma, 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 it piques their curiosity, right? And so they're just looking more. And then the categorization comes along for free. Is that clear? If that's all it is, that's fancy, that's nice, but that's not nouns going to object categories. So to test that, what we do is we present babies with different words for each of the objects, right? If it's that they understand this abstract link between the kind of word, the noun, and the category of objects, we should fail to see categorization here, which is to say, just piquing their curiosity with different words on each trial should be interesting for the baby, but it shouldn't engender or enlist the kind of core cognitive processing that permits them to form the category over and above the babies in the no-word condition. Is that clear? The logic is clear? Okay, so what we found was that by 12 months of age, it matters. If you play the babies different words for each one, they're engaged in a different cognitive task. They're not searching for the commonalities. Rather, they're searching for the distinctions among the individuals, right? This is from other work, mine and other labs as well. And rather than forming a cohesive category, they're tracking the identities of the individual objects, right? So that's really quite precise. The different kinds, they're tracking not only whether a novel word occurs in the language that they hear, the no word versus the novel word condition, but also which novel word has been applied to which individual object. And these are 12-month-olds. So this is a very sophisticated capacity, we believe. Okay, so now you could ask, is this capacity anything about language? Is this unique to words, right? Why would we care? Well, we're interested in knowing how language and concepts come together in the mind of the infant, right? They could have powerful combinatorial capacities that aren't specific to language or not specific to language yet. So the way that we test this is, will this power of the consistently applied word, can this be the case for another signal, a non-linguistic signal? And to do that, we step outside the language domain and we look at babies' categorization in the context of hearing sine wave tone sequences. So these are special tone sequences. They're matched in duration, and they're matched in mean frequency, and they're matched even in where the pauses occur to the language phrases that they've heard in the language condition. So it's kind of like, dee-dee-dee-dee, look at the toma, dee-dee-dee-dee. You see what I'm saying, I hope. In any case, so the question is what will happen in a condition like this? And what we find is that no, in the context of any consistently applied signal, here a consistently applied tone sequence, the babies fail to form the category. So what this tells us is that this link, this invitation to form categories, is specific to language, and it's in place early enough to guide infants' earliest acquisition or earliest production of novel work. Closing up this section on 12-month-olds, what do we know? We see at 12 months a principled link between words and core cognitive capacities, here categorization. This link is available even before infants have begun to produce their first words. It's sufficiently constrained to pick out the linguistic signals, not other signals like tones. It's sufficiently powerful to promote abstraction. They're coming to an abstract category, animal or vehicle or tools, what have you, right? It's sufficiently early to guide their first word learning, and yet, as I told you, think back to the picture of the little girl with the dog in the park. It's as yet unconstrained by grammatical form. Just before 12 months, any kind of word, look at the blick one, look, they're blicking, any kind of novel word highlights for the infant or invites the infant to search for any kind of commonality, right? By 12 months, as I told you, they become more precise. So this broad link, word to any kind of commonality, think of the cascade that I was talking about before, any kind of commonality but within language, right? This forms a foundation on which the baby can discover the increasingly precise links between kinds of words like nouns and verbs and kinds of relations or meaning in their language. And it makes sense that the baby would have to wait to get these more precise links for the predicate forms, the verbs and the adjectives, et cetera, because there's considerable cross-linguistic variation in how different kinds of words are marked on the surface of a sentence. Right? So they're going to have to learn how to find the nouns in their language and how to find the adjectives, et cetera, okay? So this makes developmental sense, and it makes sense with regard to linguistic theories for those of you who are from that field. That is to say that you need to have your nouns in place in order to understand what the meaning of the verb might be. So every time you see chase, to chase, you know, if the cat is chasing the mouse, every time you see chase, you also see flee, which is to say that the mouse is fleeing always when the cat is chasing. To decode what chase means, rather flee, you need to know what the two individuals are called. I hope this makes sense. So the cat is chasing the mouse tells you that it's the chase, not the flee. Anyway, so you need your nouns to learn the meanings of these predicate terms. Okay, so now that's the summary for the 12-month-olds for now, and I'm happy to answer questions later about that period. But what happened to us was we became just obsessed with where this capacity came from. And so what we started to do was look back in developmental time, using pretty much the same technique, but changing it a little bit so that it would accommodate even younger and younger infants. Okay, so we're going to use the same kind of task. And we're going to ask how and how early does language boost the infant's cognition. This time I'm showing the baby discriminably different members of the category dinosaur here and comparing it at test to the category fish. Half the babies will see fish, half the babies will see dinosaurs, right? It's considered a simpler category than the one that I showed before. Fish is not as abstract as animals in general, right? In any case, this is the demonstration that we'll use for today. And what we asked was, how early can we see this link? And we tested first 6-month-olds a long time ago. And I honestly predicted that at 6 months, language and tones should have the same effect. Why? Because at the time that I did this study, we didn't know that at this point, babies are beginning to learn the meaning, to understand the meaning of very few words. This is the work of Elika Berkelsen and Dick Aslin in the US. But in any case, at that point, we didn't think that the baby understood words, and so I thought these two signals are both interesting to the baby. And so the baby should be able to form categories equally well or equally poorly, whichever stimulus you get. But I was wrong, as you see. By 6 months, the babies fail to form the category in the tone condition, though it's matched beautifully on a sort of psychoacoustic level with what they hear in the language condition. So this invited us to look at younger infants. So I had this is a note to the postdocs and the graduate students: push your advisors to do things that they consider impossible. Alyssa Ferry was a graduate student working with me and a colleague of mine, Susan Hespos. And Alyssa wanted to know, could we see this distinction between categorization in language versus tone sequences in babies as young as 3 months of age? And I thought, no, this is never going to work. Why? We know from the literature that at 3 months, babies don't find individual words in the continuous stream of speech. They're interested in the melody of the music. It's hard to get them to find a novel word, for example, right? It's the whole phrase, not yet the words. And moreover, well, it's a hard task. The baby's going to have to look, the baby's going to have to categorize, et cetera. And so I had no sense that the babies at 3 and 4 months would be able to do this task. But Alyssa was insistent, and she was right, as usual. Students are always on the forefront here. So what we did was took babies and put them in the very same task. I'm going to show you now a little 3-month-old boy sitting on the lap of his father doing this task. I won't show the whole thing for the interest of time. And what you'll see here is what the baby's looking at. It's going to be the dinosaurs and the fish. And I'm showing it to you so that you can see 3 things. One, this is a very little baby. He can hardly lift his head off the chest of his father, right? But yet, I'll show you his performance in this task. That's number 1. Number 2, what I want you to see is that we can track the baby's looking. This is an eye tracking experiment, and we're seeing where the baby looks and using, as I told you, where the baby looks to tell us what they're learning in this task. Okay, so let me show you this little darling.
Look at the lodi. Do you see the lodi?
The sound is funny. It's look at the modi. Do you see the modi? It's a made-up word.
Look at the lodi. Do you see the lodi?
The father is wearing glasses so that he cannot see what the baby sees, and so he can't
Look at the lodi. Do you see the lodi? Look at the lodi. Do you see the lodi?
Not even really. Can't even really get up there. Okay, here comes the test phase. We center their attention, because we're going to show 2 now. And we're going to look, where does the baby look during test? Okay. So that's the task. He's a particularly adorable baby, but the babies are this attentive during the task. We tend to, quote, lose very few babies in these experiments, even in the tone conditions. It's not just the language condition. Okay, so what we found was that at 3 and 4 months, surprisingly, babies listening to the tone sequences failed to form the object category. And so if tones and language are the same, we should see the same in language, but no. In fact, what we see is that at 3 and 4 months, as at 6 months, babies listening to language form the category more successfully. Look at the toma versus do-do-do-do-do-do in this tiny little task, more successfully than babies listening to tone sequences. I hope that's clear. Okay, so this tells us that by 3 months, listening to language boosts infant cognition and does so in a way that's, that carefully matched tones do not. Wow, I'm running out of time already. Forgive me. I'll do one more series of experiments and then we can open for questions. Okay, but the question is why? Why is it the case that the baby performs this way in the categorization task listening to language? Why does language engender this effect? There are big differences between language and tones. One is complex, one is simple. One is familiar. They've never heard look at the modi, but they're very used to listening to language, right? And so we want to uncouple these low-level capacities, complexity of the signal, familiarity of the signal, with this more abstract link that I'm obsessed with, right? And so how we're going to do that is look at infants' responses to other signals, right, that are both complex and unfamiliar, and see if we can triangulate to answer questions like, is human language the only signal that offers this boost, and why does human language do this boost? Okay, now to get to that, we selected different signals, and here we found the signal of a genealogical cousin. It's the Madagascar blue-eyed lemur, and it's a non-human primate vocalization sound. We selected this particular sound. Why? Because this non-human primate vocalizes in roughly the same frequency range as we do when we speak to infants, a high frequency range. And so and the babies prefer that range, and we don't want to lose that in this experiment. So what we're going to do is see whether this also, and see whether this too, a complex but unfamiliar, uncoupling complexity and familiarity signal works. And we're going to compare this to infants' responses to backward speech, which is to say the same look at the modi, but played backwards. Why? It's about equal in complexity to the forward speech. It's the same signal, right? But it's not familiar, and we know that the infant brain responds differently in certain ways to backward speech than to forward speech. So I hope that logic is clear. Okay, if I finish up this experiment in one quick little series more. Okay, so let me show you what we get. This is a baby in the lemur condition. In the interest of time, I'm sorry, I'll go forward. It's the very same thing, but you hear the lemur calls. You'll hear them in the next experiment, so don't worry. And what we've asked is this effect specific to human vocalizations? And this is also with Alyssa Ferry, her dissertation. And what we found was when the babies listen to backward speech, it's as if they're listening to tone sequences. One is complex, one is not complex, right? And yet they're null. So complexity can't be the answer all alone, right? It can't be the complexity of the signal alone or the familiarity of the signal alone. But then we ask, well, what happens in the situation where they hear the lemur vocalizations, right? What we see is really very striking. At 3 months and at 4 months, babies listening to the lemur vocalizations instead of in the context of learning this doing this categorization task, perform exactly, like really indistinguishably from babies who are listening to language. And if you look up the paper, what you see is that the scatter plots for the babies hearing primates and non-human, humans and non-human primates lie on top of each other precisely. You can't pull them apart. But by 6 months, we see something very different. By 6 months, the babies have tuned out the link from the lemur calls to the categorization and to rule learning, for example, to other complex tasks. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us, first of all, that this capacity is not restricted to human language in the little 3-month-old, right? That the infants, here, I'm pretty sure I have this here. No, I don't. Hold on. Okay. It tells us that the babies are, that this effect early on is not restricted to human language. Instead, it emerges from a broader initial template that encompasses the vocalizations of humans and non-human primates, which is then tuned to link only to non-human primates. Okay. If you'll indulge me, I have maybe 5 minutes, okay? Just to give you one more series of experiments. We wanted to know what are the mechanisms that are responsible for the infants establishing these early links and for tuning them, right? So this is an abstract link that's being tuned, and I think it's the first evidence of tuning in an abstract way, not just the perception of the signal, but the link between the signal and core cognition capacities. Okay. Here's the one experiment I'll tell you, and then if there's time, I'll tell you another one afterwards in the discussion period. Forgive me. What we wanted to know was what's going on when the babies are listening to lemurs and listening to language. And what we wanted to think about was what is the power, as I said, of infants' exquisite sensitivity to experience, to learning, to hearing. And what we wondered was, well, between 3 or 4 and 6 months, infants hear a lot of human language. And they hear vanishingly little, if any, vocalizations of Madagascar blue-eyed lemurs, right? And so it's possible that this link between the lemur calls and core cognition just sort of atrophies. It tunes out because they have no exposure, right? So the question then is, might infants maintain the link to human vocalizations because they receive such rich experience to feed this, right? And sever the initial link to lemur calls because they're deprived of this experience. So how would you do this experiment? Well, you can't do an experiment like Bekos in Egypt tried to do, where you deprive human infants of human language and then see, you remember the example, will he say bread in this language or that language when he first utters something. That, you know, we would never want to do. But what we can do is enlist parents, primarily moms in the US, enlist parents to expose their infants to lemur vocalizations. And this way we can see whether they could maintain this link to core cognition that we see early on, that must be there early on, not from experience, but for some innate response to this signal, or some early response to this signal, because recall they haven't heard those signals before. Okay, are you with me? Okay, so here's what we did. What if we give infants experience with vocalizations of lemurs? And what we did was add a new phase in the experiment. Ultimately, they're going to see the same task as the babies I've been describing all along today. But first, we're going to give them an exposure phase. We're going to do this in 2 different experiments. I'll tell you very quickly how we did it. Before they sit down in the experimental task on the lap of their dad or their mom, out in the playroom, where the mother or the father is filling out information about the baby and the baby's becoming familiar with the setting and the surroundings, which is what we want, so that they'll be comfortable enough to perform in our tasks. While this is going on, passively in the background, the babies are being exposed to vocalizations of lemurs. And they're being exposed in a passive listening task. We embed distinct lemur calls at random intervals within a segment of instrumental music, right? So it's the ambient environment. It's precisely not meant to refer to any particular individual. So let me give you a sense of what this sounds like, and you'll hear the lemurs. By the way, of course, during this exposure phase, they don't hear the lemur vocalization they're going to hear once we pop them into the task. We're just giving them exposure to lemur vocalizations. It's a musical loop. It goes on for 10 minutes. Within the 10 minutes, there's 2 minutes, exactly 2, and only 2 minutes of different lemur vocalizations that the baby's hearing, okay? And the question is, what will happen? And so in the first experiment, we just exposed them to these in the lab waiting room and then put them in the experiment. And what we found was that after this minimal amount of listening, the babies now formed the object category as if they had been 4-month-olds. Remember that 6-month-olds ordinarily would not show this effect. They would be null. So we asked, well, maybe this is just a priming effect. Maybe anything you hear connected to such beautiful music will augment or boost your attention. What would happen if we embedded backward speech in the same paradigm? And I won't make you listen to that, but it's exactly the same. Babies sitting in the lab listening to backward speech don't form the object category. So it says that for an initially privileged signal, something that was in the broader template to begin with, we can preserve or maintain that. We can bring it back, reinstate it, right? If we give the baby some exposure, the power of exposure. Now you might think, well, maybe it's just a very short-lived effect. And so to answer that, it's a very important question, right? How the baby learns. And so to answer that question, we borrowed designs from perceptual tuning experiments, beautiful, careful designs where you provide babies with exposure to a signal, here lemur vocalizations, pretty frequently at the beginning of a training phase, and then it becomes less, it's a tapered design, less and less frequently, less and less exposure over time. To do this, we enlisted the babies and their moms at 4 months of age when the lemur sounds are still, quote, working to promote core cognitive capacities. And for 6 weeks, they listened to lemur vocalizations. The parents call this monkey music. They listened to this at home on this tapered schedule, so that by the time they come into the lab at 6 months, they should have already left this behind. This link should be severed, right? And if it's not just hearing the lemur sounds right in the middle, right before the task, but rather it's tuning the brain, if you will, to permit you to preserve this link, then we should be able to see it in these infants as well. So the babies coming into the lab in this experiment hadn't heard a lemur vocalization for 3 days, right? But they had had plenty of exposure to it. And what we see is exactly the same effect. That is, experience with this particular signal, but not a signal outside of this system, not the backward speech, not the tone sequences, guides which of the initially privileged links the baby will maintain and which they will sever. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm afraid I'm not going to tell you about a different route that we've looked at. This was the route for infants' initially privileged signals, but we also are very interested in how we, this is, right, so for signals like lemur calls, mere exposure is sufficient to reinstate or to maintain it. For signals outside that, like tones or backward speech, mere exposure is insufficient to permit the baby to create a new link de novo. What I'm going to leave out for now, but I'm happy to talk about later, is that for these signals, outside the baby's initially privileged set, tone sequences, et cetera, we can see the power of social communicative status. Let me move quickly to respect your time differences here. I'll explain all this if you like later. Okay, so in sum, what we see is a surprisingly early link between language and core cognitive capacities. It's exquisitely responsive to experience. This link first emerges as part of a much broader template. We're not talking nouns and verbs. We're talking listening to language versus listening to backward speech or tone sequences. As a much broader template, which includes the vocalizations of both humans and non-human primates. Infants then tune this link to humans, to the signals that will eventually carry meaning. They may carry very little meaning, or they certainly don't refer at 3 and 4 months, but they will eventually, and the babies are tuning to this, which serves them in good stead to learn about language and how language and cognition work together. Okay. We talked about the mechanisms that guide infants' ability to establish them. I did talk to you about the signals within infants' initial template and showed you the power of mere exposure for what the baby came to the task with, right? What I didn't show you, sorry, was that for signals outside the baby's initial template, like tones and backward speech and other inert signals, what we see is the power of social communicative status. And then there are several remaining questions, some of which I hope you'll ask me about. Ask me anything, of course. One is, what are the boundary conditions on the kinds of signals that infants will link to cognition? I've told you about human language, and I've told you about lemur calls, right? There's a vast difference between these. What are the characteristics? Is it a natural kind, those sorts of signals that will promote versus won't promote? Can we identify something in the acoustics of these signals? That's a question that we don't know the answer to, but what we're working on in describing, in identifying the boundary conditions is how far or how narrow this initial link will go. And what we've looked at so far is infants' responses, ours are English acquiring infants, not to English, but to foreign languages. And I can tell you about that a bit. It just got accepted in the weekend that I came here, just last weekend. And it's a study in which the babies don't listen to their native language, English, but instead they hear either one or the other language. One is a near language acoustically. It's German for the English acquiring infants. Or they hear a language that's acoustically very, very different, and that's Cantonese. Right, the rhythm and the sounds of the words are quite different. And what we see is that at 4 months, this is a study with 4-month-olds, 4-month-olds listening to a language that's close, perceptually close to their language, successfully form the object categories, but they've already tuned out the non-native language that sounds so very different. Lots of really important questions there about how they tune language specifically, but yet still admit the lemur vocalizations. I'm happy to talk with you about that. We've also looked at other kinds of non-human vocalizations of non-human creatures, and we've looked so far at birdsong, and we find null effects. So at least if you think of a genealogic tree or an evolutionary tree, if you have humans and you have the lemurs over here, they're one of our most distant primate cousins. Birds is too far away, we imagine. The next question is what would happen with mammal vocalizations. Maybe it's something about the vocal tract that initially makes this happen, right? It's not going to get them to language. For that, they're going to need both exposure and, importantly, a signal that has enough complexity and enough specificity to carry the kind of meaning that a human language carries, right? Lemur vocalizations aren't going to have that. And so the babies are going to tune that out anyway after 6 months. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's one question. What are the boundary conditions? Another question I highlighted at the beginning of the talk, what other cognitive capacities are also boosted by language? Well, thus far, we've looked at categorization quite a lot, and we've looked at abstract rule learning. For those of you in the field, it's the abstract rule learning task that was first done by Gary Marcus and his colleagues, where they showed successful categorization for language stimuli, but not, successful abstract rule learning for language stimuli like ba, ba, pa, but not successful abstract word learning, rule learning. Please pardon me, it's the jet lag, I'm sure. Non-successful rule learning when they were presented with tone sequences. What we did was show that if you make the tone sequences communicative in the way that we did in our categorization task, very quickly, just a pre-task exposure period, which I can show you later, now the babies form the abstract rules, abstract geometric algebraic rules just as well as the babies in the language condition. So infusing the tones with communicative status gives those tones whatever it takes for the babies to apprehend this very abstract rule learning. We're currently working on tasks that don't have to do with abstraction, like a categorization task or a rule learning task, but rather individuation, tracking the distinct individual elements in a sequence, or the distinct individuals in your life, your mom versus your dad versus your puppy, right? And those are experiments that are ongoing that I'd also be happy to talk with you about. And then finally, here I'm bringing coals to Newcastle, which is to say I'm coming to the seat of, the very best work in infant neural responses to stimuli in their world. And what we've been asking is, what are the neural mechanisms that underlie these first links that the babies form between certain kinds of signals, as I've described for you, and kinds of meaning or kinds of abstraction? And so far, what we've done is we have basically 3 questions, and I have no answers yet. We have 14 babies in the study at this point, so it's not quite enough. But it's my first foray into neural development, and it's absolutely exciting, and hats off to this group who have sort of formed the foundation for asking these kinds of questions. First, we ask at entry points, at 3 and 4 months, when the lemur and the language sounds evoke the same behavioral response in tiny infants. Do they do so by the same neural roots or by different neural roots? A second question will be, once the links become tuned, can we trace how, at 6 months, the response to the lemur vocalizations changes over the 4 to 6 month period? And then finally, the designs I didn't talk to you about, when we bring in a new signal and give it communicative status, does it start to take on? How does that look in the neural representation of that signal, say a tone? Okay, so now just to close, and thank you so much for your prolonged attention. What I hope I've shown you is that, like Alcaeus, an ancient Greek poet, once said, language exerts a hidden power like the moon on the tides. That's a hidden power in a 6-month-old because they're not speaking yet, and certainly the 3-month-old as well, right? Far earlier than any of us could have imagined, language is not only fancy in the human mind, but it fuels the human mind. It catalyzes our quintessentially human, social, communicative, and representational capacities, those capacities I talked about at the very beginning of the talk. The effect of language increases exponentially in precision over the first year of life, and it helps the baby to discover how distinct components of language align with other rich representational capacities, cognitive capacities. And this, I believe, is the signature of our species. Thanks so much for your attention.